Definitely, it's a significant event, and I think it's one that, like, I hear a lot of people talking about it. There's a lot of anticipation, similar to what there was with an ETFs, and maybe there's a lesson we can learn from the ETFs, right?
Joining me this week is Janine, our CEO, and she's going to give a little bit of a basics about what is the Bitcoin halving and why it isn't that scary.
Absolutely. Thanks, Patrick. It's a very common misconception that somehow the value of Bitcoin or your number of Bitcoin is cut in half. None of that. It's really about the supply of new Bitcoin that comes into the system. That's what gets halved. So the way that Bitcoin network operates, you might have heard of miners. Miners are the ones who are creating or helping run the network by putting new blocks in, and every transaction has to go to a block, and then every block joined into the chain of blocks of the network. That's where we get the word blockchain from. And miners are the ones who do that work, who solve complex mathematical equations, use a lot of computer energy in order to help keep that network running. And as a reward for what they do, miners receive money in two ways. You will pay a transactional fee when you see the Bitcoin, when you make a Bitcoin transaction, that goes to the miners. And they also get some brand new, freshly minted, hot off the press Bitcoin every time they add a new block. And that is what is being halved. Every day we get around 150 new Bitcoin blocks, and every time a new block is made, those miners get 6.25 new Bitcoin. So that's roughly the amount of new Bitcoin entering the system, as I'm just going to balls my math on the fly, around 1,000 Bitcoin a day coming into the system. So when the halving event happens, that reward gets cut in half, and the amount of new Bitcoin coming into the system is halved down to around 500 a day. How's my stats, Patrick? You got anything to add there?
Oh, yeah. So Bitcoin halving stats, really, really interesting. Yeah, you pretty much hit the nail on the head that, yeah, it just decreases the amount of new Bitcoin halving. And generally people talk about it happening every 4 years. Doesn't actually happen every 4 years. It just happens to coincidentally coincide. What it actually does is it's every 210,000 blocks. And at a target time of 10 minutes a block, that works out to be about every 4 years. So Bitcoin first block, the Genesis block, was mined in 2008. Then in 2012, we had our first Bitcoin halving. Originally, the Bitcoin reward per block was 50 Bitcoin.
Those were the days, huh?
A lot of Bitcoin, but the price also at this point was only about $12 per Bitcoin. So still a lot of money, but not quite as much as it is net.
Wait, you're saying $12 per Bitcoin back on the original cycle? Like, it would have been cents, surely, right?
No, because the original cycles, they were like 2011-ish thereabouts. And this was actually the first kind of run, because so about 150 days later, it was about $120. So the halving event went from 50 Bitcoin to 25 Bitcoin. That happened at block 210,000.
That was a good block.
2016, we had our second Bitcoin halving. The reward went from 25 Bitcoin to 12.5 Bitcoin. Price at this time, about $650. A lot better than 12. But 150 days later, it was a little bit better. It was $750. And then finally, the last halving, something that some people might have remembered, might have actually lived through. I certainly remember. I was really excited. This is the first halving that I was kind of actively watching for. Right, it was 4 years ago. Went from 12.5 Bitcoin down to 6.25. The price, some people might remember, it's about $8,800 US. 150 days later, I should say, it was over $10,000 for the first time and actually stayed that way for quite a long period of time.
So what I'm hearing is that post-halving, you've historically seen a price rise. Are those things linked, can we say, or is it correlation doesn't equal causation?
So correlation, causation, very good point there. So I think it's probably the reasons why people think the Bitcoin halvings are important. They are significant events. And those same reasons also mean the price goes up. They're very significant for people who watch the price, who want to buy and sell. Janine, is the Bitcoin halving a significant event for you? How does it change things as somebody who holds Bitcoin?
Definitely, it's a significant event, and I think it's one that I hear a lot of people talking about it. There's a lot of anticipation, similar to what there was with an ETFs, and maybe there's a lesson we can learn from the ETFs, right? Buy the rumors, sell the news. That's what we saw with the ETFs, is a lot of people were speculating in the lead up to it, and then prices dropped immediately afterwards as everyone who'd been holding just for that one event to take place sold off. I do think things will be different with the Bitcoin halving though, because it's not this clear-cut one point in time. As you've alluded to, Patrick, the understanding or the kind of the view of the market is that the dynamic is that around, halving takes place, and then around 4 to 6 months later, you see a big price movement up. So people who are buying the rumor, selling news, they won't be selling immediately after the halving. They'll be waiting to see where the prices go. And the more people that have that view of let's see where the prices go, the more that supply and demand, that, equation will imbalance. And I think that's probably a key thing. I mean, you and I, we're both economists by training. Supply and demand is sort of our bread and butter. And the very core of the Bitcoin halving is the fact that supply, new Bitcoins being created, is halving. So there's got to be an impact on price. If demand stays constant and supply drops, price will go up. If demand increases because people expect the price to go, if demand increases because people expect price to go up and supply drops, that's an even greater sort of input, I guess, into that equation.
The illusion of scarcity can create scarcity in and of itself. If people think that something's going to be worth more in the future, well, often it actually does become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If enough people believe something and all pull in the same direction, then normally it happens. And it's interesting with Bitcoin, right? Because the part of it, that's one of the reasons why it's significant to people financially, is there will only be 21 million Bitcoin. And this is kind of a bit of a...
That's not even enough for every Australian to have one, right?
Yeah, just hit 27 million.
I don't even think it's enough that not every billionaire in the world could have a Bitcoin. I think there's more than 21 million of those, right? So when you put in that kind of perspective, like the scarcity is quite fascinating.
Yeah, it actually completely off topic, but reminds me of something that Satoshi once actually said on the Bitcoin Talk forums. Is that he imagines one Satoshi will one day be worth the equivalent of $1. And that's kind of how he got to that number with how many Satoshis there was kind of his plans.
A Satoshi is the smallest unit you can have of a Bitcoin. So for anyone who doesn't know, while we're talking about, there's only 21 million Bitcoins, they are divisible down to 8 decimal places. So, 1/1,000,000th. So you don't have to buy a whole Bitcoin. You can buy just a tiny sliver of one. And yeah, the tiniest sliver you can get of a Bitcoin is called a Satoshi, named after the pseudonymous creator of Bitcoin.
And the halving was something that Satoshi implemented because he wanted the currency to be deflationary. He didn't want year on year your money to be less valuable. We're currently living with a lot of inflation at the moment, which means the prices of things are going up, which means per $100 you can get less and less and less now than you could 5 years ago. With Bitcoin, he wanted it to work in the other way. And that's why he implemented the halving, was so that over time your money should get more valuable as more people drive into it. They're not just going to make more Bitcoin. No, there is an upper limit, and it slowly does trickle down.
Which it's a fascinating contrast to traditional currencies, right? The inflation that you're talking about, that comes from something called quantitative easing, which is basically governments print new money or create more money supply. And that's something we saw a huge amount of over COVID. Governments were wanting to put a lot more, money into the economy, get more money going around, help shore up an economy that could have otherwise fallen over. And that money printing or quantitative easing results in inflation. It's pretty tied to economic principle. And so to have a currency that, doesn't work that way, there is no way that someone can just create more Bitcoin without, the system is structured in a way that is, say, deflationary. Is deflationary the right word here? Possibly not, but it's like it does, act in a very different way from inflationary currencies, and it's a really interesting economic experiment, yes.
And it creates this almost paradox. And this is so hyperinflation exists is because people spend all of their money now because they know it's not going to be worth anything in the future, right? And that is almost a self-perpetuating cycle. But imagine you had $100 today, but you knew next year is going to be worth the equivalent of $200. Well, there's actually quite a lot of incentive not to spend it, right? And that's why deflationary is considered quite potentially dangerous within economies, because it means it becomes a self-fulfilling cycle. No one spends money, the velocity of money slows down, no one's spending money. Well, shopkeepers, people aren't making as much money. It kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in the same way hyperinflation occurs. And to design a currency that is inherently deflationary from day one does actually almost act as a bit of an anchor there. Like whether the costs versus the benefit.
It's a bit anti-capitalist, right? Because this whole thing of inflation being good is a very capitalist view, and it's something that, for the last couple of 100 years we've held, but economies don't always work that way. And probably that's a whole other rabbit hole to go down, but,
Oh, yeah. the point I was going to make, and to very good point, Janine, like 100% spot on, is that it acts as almost a disincentive towards other things as using it as a currency. Currencies you kind of want people to spend because you want that velocity. And it just means the other benefits that Bitcoin brings needs to outweigh that counteracting effect. Because if you have the choice of spending one thing or spending another thing, and one thing is better to spend, you're more likely to spend that thing, right? Better money pushes, bad money pushes out good money is a really, I'm not going to go into where that comes from, really old economic terms.
All right. To sum up, though, where should we sum with this?
Oh,
You've learned a lot that you didn't necessarily know that you want us to know about money markets, capital economies, and how our money supply works. But in terms of Bitcoin,
and I think you've just realized how much of a nerd me and Janine are.
we could go on for hours. Maybe we should do a Facebook Live on this if anyone actually wants to chat this kind of economic nerdery with us. But short story on Bitcoin halving is it's coming up probably around mid to late April, and will reduce the supply of new Bitcoin into the system from roughly 1,000 a day to 500 a day. It may be followed by a positive price action, but that really does depend on market supply and demand forces, and it's something that we'll be watching very closely and definitely interested to live through to see it another Bitcoin halving.
Yeah, and last thing I just want to shout out is our marketing team's generated this really cool Bitcoin countdown clock that's sitting on our knowledge base. So we'll also link to that down below for everyone. But that, I think, wraps up this week's CEO on Lobster. Thank you all for joining us again. And if you've got any ideas for new topics, let us know in the comments down below.
See you next time.